Our tradition here is on the second Sunday morning of each month, we'll go through a lesson on what our young people were studying in their our spiritual heritage curriculum. And this morning, in the midst of their studies about our God being good at victory, one of the best verses about the victory that we enjoy and have because of Jesus Christ was presented to us in the scripture reading. The victory over the fear of death. No greater victory could ever be had. I've often wondered how hard and difficult it must have been for the disciples when Jesus had been with them for so long, and it wasn't that he had not warned them that his death was impending, but when Jesus had finally died, when he had been led away and crucified and put to death, not just in a matter where his life just slipped away, but when his life was ripped away by being mercilessly crucified upon a cross. That it must have been difficult for those days, though they were short, to wonder about all that he had said and done, and now he was gone. As Peter said, I go fishing. And it almost seems like the apostles and disciples were willing to go back to their normal lives and leave behind everything, because death has that feeling and sensation of finality, that it is all. Aristotle once said that death is to be feared more than anything else because it appears to be the end of everything. Some philosophers have said that death claims and removes all meaning from life. And I think for many people that's what death is like. I've conducted a lot of funerals in the time that I've been preaching. Most of them have been for Christians, and those have been joyous events. But some have been for those who are not Christians, where there was absolutely no hope whatsoever of that person being saved. One particular individual that I can remember very vividly, that while he was dying and knew that he only had a few days left, wanted me to do his funeral. And he told me that in the funeral that he wanted me to let his family know that they needed to get their life right so they did not go where he was going. And though he had moments, he had a few more days where he could make things right with God, he insisted that it was too late and nothing that he could do. But he wanted his family to be warned, don't follow in his steps. When you think about what this verse means, victory over the fear of death, I think sometimes we forget that this fear of death that's being spoken of here is something that holds us captive. It says in the very passage that it's a bondage, it is slavery that holds us captive, and that Jesus gives us victory over that. So this morning's lesson is one about not only what is it that causes us to fear death, but how is it that we can obtain that victory over that fear of death. So if you're ready for your 3 words, let's see your notebooks held up high this morning. Very good. Okay, your 3 words are the words assurance, confidence, and peace. Words that are not often associated with the concept of death. But for us as Christians, we know that they are associated with it so often in our vernacular, in our classes, in our lessons. But in our day-to-day lives and the way in which we see things, they may not be there the way that they should. Then in our day of death, do we see that as a day of assurance, that we know for certain where it is that we're going, that we have assurance that we have held on to, and that gives us great confidence on what's going to happen on that other side. There's so many dark mysteries that await us that we don't have the answers for and don't know what's going to happen. That even when you go through the scriptures and you see those individuals who were resurrected, those few individuals resurrected from the dead, they don't give us details about that other side. They're only images and visions and imagery that is used to describe what's on that other side. But we know that we can have confidence about what awaits us on that other side, and that should give us peace. If there is something that we should most often seek for when it comes to this struggle that we have with this bondage of fear of death, is to have not just assurance and not just confidence, but be at peace to know that Jesus lives, and because of that, I will live as well. To give me peace. Death is one of those things that is inescapable. And even in the scriptures, there's been a lot of images that are used to describe the terror and the idea of what death may hold. There's one passage I wanted to share with you in Job chapter 18. Job 18, verse 14. And you remember all the horrible things that happened to Job and the way in which even his friends didn't have much to say, and when they did, it wasn't helpful, it wasn't comforting. But as Bildad is talking about the way in which things had gone with Job and the way in which he looked and that death seems to be impending, Job 18, verse 14, notice how death is described. He is uprooted from the shelter of his tent, and they parade him before the king of terrors. When the Bible talks about death, and some of those in the Bible talk about death, they do talk about it as being a terrifying experience, paraded as a hostage, as a slave to the king of terrors that awaits. People try to avoid death through a lot of different ways. We try to ignore it, that whistling past the graveyard, that we're not going to look over there and think about the fact that one day we're going to be in that coffin, one day we're going to be beneath that ground, that one day we're going to have a tombstone, that tombstone is going to have our name on it, is going to have a beginning date and an ending date, and we don't like to think about that. Sometimes people want to delay it. We do a lot of things to try to make sure that we prolong our life. We try to take good care of ourselves, eat right, and some people become very obsessed with that. They're held hostage to the idea that I've got to do something to delay death from coming. That sometimes people try to do great things. They try to live lives a certain way so that their name outlives their body, so that people will talk about them for generations to come. And we obsess about things like that, even though we're not going to know anything about it once that grave comes to us. There's a lot of things that Satan has done to us to try to make us think that we can escape that fate that awaits all of us. And because of that, we're held captive by it. Why is it then that we fear? What is it that causes so much fear of death? And in the scriptures, and in this passage that was read for us in Hebrews chapter 2, we get a glimpse of that, and we understand that the bondage of sin that we talked about last week from Romans chapter 6, the bondage of sin and the bondage of death are closely associated in scriptures. That when you go back to the very, very beginning in Genesis, and I appreciate what Nathan was talking about around the Lord's Supper table this morning and reminding us that in the beginning we had this relationship, this closeness with God. But Satan steps into the picture, and Eve knows that God says that in the day you eat of the fruit of that tree, you will die. There was a healthy fear of that tree because she knew that it would bring death. And what Satan did was step in and he said simply, you will not die. You will not die. And what will a person do to escape death? And after all, it was a tree that was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and able to make one wise. And Satan says, if you will listen to me, you will not die. God's trying to keep you from a real life, but I'm telling you, you won't die. And then we see with Cain, that Cain is told that your countenance has fallen and it should not be so. Sin is lying at the door and its desires for you, but you remember what he is told. But you should rule over it. And Satan constantly reminds us that you trusted me for life, and I am telling you now, you have never completely ruled over that sin that's been at your door. That sin comes knocking at your door and you open it time after time after time again, and you know good and well that means you are going to die. Not just physically, but spiritually. You have no hope, you have no comfort, you have no one to guide you, you have nothing. God did this to you because he put a tree in the midst of the garden and then told you not to touch it because he didn't want you to be like him. It's death from the very beginning. And throughout all of our generations, we've been held hostage to that concept of death because we know that we are going to die because of the sin that entered into the world, and we have all sinned, and we know that that's going to mean spiritual death as well, and we have no confidence in the end. We're afraid of it. We're terrified of it. It keeps us up at night. It causes us to tremble. It causes us to doubt. It causes us to be suspicious. It causes us to go down different paths and to look for answers elsewhere. But the scriptures tell us that it can be conquered and that Jesus did indeed conquer it from the beginning. In Romans chapter 5, it tells us in verses 12 through 21, that very thing that I was talking about a moment ago, that in Adam and the sin that he committed, death entered into the world, and death spread to all mankind because all have sinned. But there's a stark contrast that is made between Adam and Jesus. That just as it is that there was an opportunity for death that entered into the world because of the sin that was first committed, because of Jesus Christ, there's an opportunity for life. And that life can spread, and that life can spread to all of mankind. And for us as Christians, that life has spread to us. But does it actually feel that way? Does it seem like deliverance? Romans chapter 6 that we talked about last week in verses 6 through 11. Does it feel like that if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with Him? Because just as when Jesus was raised from the dead and went to the right hand of God, death no longer has dominion over Him. The verses are not telling us that we will not experience death in the flesh or that we won't experience hardship in the flesh, but it means it does not have rule and reign over us. I'm not going to live my life in fear of what death is going to bring. A lot easier said than done. I'm not going to live in terror of that. I'm going to stop letting it keep me up at night. I'm going to trust more in what God has said and the promises that He has made. And I know that because of what Christ did. Inasmuch then as Christ suffered in the flesh for us, that He tasted death, and He tasted death for each one of us. But then again, why is it that we fear it so much? Another reason is because we just don't understand it. All we've ever known is living in the flesh. We don't know anything else. And because of that, it's very unknown to us. And we don't want to give up all the things that we have here. You remember in Job, again, the 2nd chapter, that when Job is going to be tempted and tested and tried, that Satan says, skin for skin, life for life. All that a man has, he will give for his life. How much money are people willing to give up if it just gives them a longer period of living, to buy life, to buy that time? Everything that a man has, he'll give for that. But in Matthew chapter 6, it tells us that if these are the treasures that we've laid up, if time here is what we have laid up, the opportunity to stay longer here is what we've laid up as our treasure, that's where our heart's going to be. If we're trying to desperately hold on for additional years and additional time of life, no one wants to die young. We understand that. But if the thing that we're living for is just for more time here, maybe that's why we hold on to so many of the things that are here. Because this is where our heart is. It's where our treasure is. It's where our reward is. But we know that this life isn't forever. And that it will be taken from us. In Hebrews 9 and verse 27, it tells us very plainly that you have no control over it. It's appointed for man to die once, and after this, the judgment day. And that's how it is that Satan holds us captive. After this, the judgment. All will be there, whether they believe or not, whether they practice or not, all will be there and make that appointment. But how is it then that we can be freed from that? 1 Corinthians 15, 54 through 57, verses that we study and read so often. And I do want us to go through a few of these passages and read them and really sink in what's being told to us. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 54 through 57. So when this corruptible, this outer body, this thing that is decaying and vanishing, when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Death is supposed to mean something different for us. It doesn't mean the same as it does for other people. For us, it is a deliverance. For us, it is being set free from captivity. You remember how it was, and we talked about this last week, that when we were baptized, how it was that you realized you were set free from sin. It no longer had claim to you. Whenever it is you pass from this life, death no longer has claim to you any longer. There's nothing else it can do to you. There's nothing else that it can inflict upon you. There's no more pain or suffering that follows it after that. It is deliverance. It is freedom that's been given to us. And in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, our passage that was read for us, it reminds us that Jesus is the one who conquered death. And if you notice the way in which He conquered death was because He experienced it. Jesus did not send in an invading army onto death. He did not send legions of angels and attack death or attack Satan or attack Hades. He didn't do any of those things. The way in which Jesus conquered death was by experiencing it, by tasting of it, by taking part in it. Jesus destroyed death up close and personal. Jesus conquered death by being there in the flesh, in the person, and going through it, just as we all have to face it. And Jesus faced it even when he was in the garden and prayed that if there be any other way than this, let it be. Because that suffering and the agony that was going to be there was something that was indeed like being paraded to the king of terror. That's what it would have been like. And Jesus went through it. And when Jesus went through it, he killed and destroyed death. He didn't just taste death, because if he had just tasted death, then he would have eternal separation from God, because that's what we're all deserving of. But he conquered death. He defeated death, because as Acts chapter 2 says, he could not be held by it. And because of that, he is able to conquer it. So, brethren, the same way in which Jesus conquered death, that victory that Jesus has over the death, is the same victory that we have. We are not going to be held by it. It is a moment. It's a twinkling of the eye. It was not possible for death to hold Jesus captive. And it's not possible for us. That's why when we have those funerals for our brethren, and we can talk about, like it says in Revelation 14:13, it's a blessed thing. It's a deliverance. It's precious in the sight of the Lord. Just like for you and I, when we see the birth of a child, it's deliverance of the saints from all the burdens of this life. That's the victory that Jesus gives to us. That's the confidence and assurance that Jesus gives to us. And that is the thing that many have longed for. That in Philippians 1, verses 21 through 24, you remember that Paul said that he was in a hard fix between the two, desiring to be with the Lord, which he says is far better. He uses the word in that passage that says depart. To depart, which means to loose up, for the spirit to be set free from the body, to be in the presence of the Lord. He talks about it being far better, which is an intense expression of desire for him. As he says to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 6, that we who are in this tent are earnestly desiring to put it off. That there's something that is more, there's something that is better that's waiting for us. And that's what we are earnestly looking forward to, and know with assurance that it is coming. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, Paul himself, again, speaks of himself when he says, finally, there's laid up for me. That he knows his time is coming. That is very short, within days, most likely, and he'd be delivered from that body. And he uses the expression, finally, that it is time, is what he's been looking forward to. We shouldn't fear death, because as Psalm 23, verse 4 reminds us that, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. That we are not alone when we pass through that moment. That as it was with the rich man and Lazarus, that the angels came and took Lazarus' body. What a comforting thought it should be for us, that our brethren, the saints, that when they die, that angels enter into that room, that angels take that soul, that angels deliver them to that abode to await for that day of judgment. What a beautiful thought it is to know that as the thief on the cross, that Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. What a comforting thought it should be to us. As Peter said that Jesus told me the way in which I'm going to die. I want to remind you while I'm in this tent, but I'm about to put off this tent. He saw it as being nothing but a temporary dwelling place. And Jesus had told him what it was going to be. And we know, if tradition is correct, the way in which Peter met his doom, being crucified upside down, because he didn't deem himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. Putting off a tent and getting a new dwelling place. In John 11, Jesus reassured Martha that he was the resurrection and the life, and that her brother would come forth from the grave. Because Jesus has the power to say Lazarus, and Lazarus would come forth. And in the end, we know that there's going to be a great trumpet and a great time, As John 5 reminds us, when all who are in the grave will hear his voice, the same as Lazarus did, and the same as Lazarus, they will come forth. And we who are Christians, we know, as Paul taught the Thessalonian brethren, we will rise to be with the Lord forever. Death does not have dominion. Death cannot hold you. It cannot contain you. It is but for a moment, a twinkling of an eye, as Paul told the Corinthians, when we will go through that change and we'll be with the Lord. It should give us great comfort and peace. Revelation 21 and verse 4. I don't know how many sermons I have preached at funerals where that passage has been quoted. Sadly, it's probably been quoted more at funerals than it has been for us who are alive to hear. Because it teaches us that God will wipe away every tear. No more death, no more sorrow. Those former things will have passed away. No more. That's peace, and that is comfort. In Revelation 22, both of those chapters, those closing chapters in Revelation, teach us about the great blessings that await us. And in Revelation 22 and verse 15, we who are inside will not have to any longer deal with this. Dogs, sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, idolaters, and whoever loves and practices a lie. I don't like dealing with those things now. They vex my soul, and as it was with Lot, it vexes our souls daily. We struggle with it. Often it invades our homes. It insults us. It degrades the thing that God created. But to know we will one day be delivered from those things. Revelation 14:13 that I mentioned earlier tells us very plainly, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed. Blessed. Jesus came to conquer the fear of death. And though much of what we talked about today was about physical death, really the passage is more emphasizing the spiritual. And just like it is that grave is to no longer have dominion over you, that it's not possible for it to contain you. So it's supposed to be with sin and the power of sin and the bondage of sin as well. There is deliverance that is available. That deliverance from sin is available to you now. And is able to deliver you from that bondage, not just today, but to the end of your life, to know with great assurance and confidence that you will ever be with the Lord. That on the day of your death, you can say, today I will be with him in paradise. That's blessedness. That's deliverance. That is confidence. That is peace. That is assurance. And that will keep us from trying to hold on so desperately to the things that are passing away and being held captive by all of the sin and pollution that Satan has put into this world. Because this is just a moment, and it will all pass in the blinking of an eye. At that last day, when we can all look forward to hearing that trumpet and hearing the Lord's voice come forth. That's what we long for, and that's the victory that Jesus gives. And so my question I'm going to leave with you this morning is, do you want to be freed from the fear of death? We need to stop letting death be a weapon of Satan and let it be one of the great tools that the Lord uses to keep us faithful and strong, courageous, joyful, and full of hope. Don't let Satan use it as a weapon. Instead, let it be one of the great blessings that the Lord has given to us as well. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, if you do want to be delivered from that fear, if you need help because you've been held captive by that, if you don't know what it takes to be a Christian and you want more information about that, if you're ready to obey the gospel, whatever that is, we stand ready to help you in any way we can. As together we stand and sing, please come if we can be of assistance.